Hi, everybody, and welcome to a show we call The Great Transition. So, we've been speaking to some amazing people over the last couple of months, and I've got an amazing guest for you today who is someone that when I first met her, I immediately had this kind of deep respect for her way of thinking and her background. And there's so much people don't know about you, Hege, in terms of where you've been and your back. I even found some photos of you as a photographer, which is part of your previous life the other day when I was searching for that. So we'll get into that in a minute. We call it the Great Transition because we see that everywhere the post-fossil carbon economy is being born, everywhere you look. But not everyone sees it yet. Not everyone sees it equally. So we're really keen to shine a spotlight on that and help others understand what's happening and get excited by what's coming. This show actually is part of a series which we're turning into a book. So later in this year, the Great Transition book will come out, and we want it to be a really practical guide for people who see that there's an amazing job to be done, are slightly scared by it, but are actually more excited by it and feel that maybe they could use their creativity and their energy and their mental strength and all their resilience to try and help make change happen rather than letting the waves and the fires take us, which is not what this is about. So we're all about human ingenuity. And what we find in all these sessions is that typically people are really keen to find special ways to think and new ways to act and just ways of framing the problem that can help them break through. And in every conversation we've had, we always uncover some kind of really interesting insight, often quite psychological, about how to get through that. And I'm pretty sure that with Hege today we will. So without further ado, I don't know whether I should introduce you. I think maybe you'd like to introduce yourself and do a better job than I will. And then we'll get into the rest of the conversation and we can go from there. So tell us a little bit about you, please.
Right. Well, great to be here. Nice to meet you all. And thanks for inviting me, Leo, as well. Introducing myself, I'll do the short version. And then if you think I should add something to that, because it's not an obvious necessarily route, start with what I do today. So my name is Hege Sæbjørnsen. I'm Norwegian, but I live in London and work out of the UK. But I've worked with a big global organization for the last 9 years that most people will be aware of, called Inka Group Ikea. Depending on the audience, I don't always have to explain who that is, but it might be worth mentioning that we're the world's biggest furniture company. Of course, if we're in a room, if I'm in a physical room with an audience and I ask people to put a hand up if they own something from Ikea, the irony is that most people will put their hand up. So that says something about our reach. But my current role is I am the circular strategy lead for Inka Group, which means that I look at how we drive our strategy to become a more circular business across retail centers, shopping centers, and investments. We are, of course, one brand. IKEA is a big company, but I specifically sit on the consumer-facing side of IKEA. So I look at looking at the total system, how we drive consumer-facing business models towards circularity, how we link to our climate agenda, but equally and increasingly how we link to our just transition and social impact agenda, the commerciality of that, but also how we invest in this transition. But before going into sort of more deep on my role, I guess it's worth just sort of keeping it relatively high level and saying that I've been working in corporate sustainability for about 10 years, but I was in the social innovation, social entrepreneurship space for about 6 years before that. And as a kind of a whistle-stop tour of my journey, I started my career as a photographer for about 8 years. So there was an interesting journey and a few transitions on a personal and professional level along the way. But I started studying both graphic design and fine art and did a master's in communication and photography. So that gives you kind of a snapshot of the less obvious route to where I am today, maybe sort of raising a few questions as well. But I'll stop there.
That's pretty good. Tell me something. Do you find that there's anything from your time as a photographer that somehow lives on with you when you're doing your work now in this space? I mean, is there some kind of DNA that carries through?
Yeah, absolutely. I've thought about this a lot because, of course, in this space, which is relatively young, right? Sustainability and corporate sustainability is a relatively young sector, although, of course, we've had climate scientists and environmentalists for a long time. So it's not a given that everybody who ends up, say, in corporate sustainability has an environmental master's degree or scientific background. There's quite a lot of different routes into these spaces and these jobs. Yeah. And I would say that reflecting back, and I do this sort of regularly because we're always transitioning and I feel that I'm always on the way somewhere. But of course, there was a point when I decided my educational route. And I remember very clearly, there was one very specific conversation I had, which could have gone either way. It was a sliding door moment of either pursuing my creativity in the arts, taking a risk. And I was lucky to have my parents' support to do so, leave Norway and go into the world and study creativity and design. But I could have also equally have gone into political and social sciences. And the irony is that I see all of that coming back in one sort of holistic model now. I'm very grateful for having gone down the creative route, because design thinking and creative process mindset, in my mind, for my work, is really essential for the complex challenges that we need to solve. And I don't have to be, a specialist on life cycle analysis modeling, or have all the technical expertise in everything I do, but I do see it being essential to have the understanding of trusting a creative process and bringing the right people in that process to solve various complex challenges. So that's kind of quite macro, but of course photography is sort of even a subset of that. But I think the creativity and the ability to navigate complex challenges and finding solutions, regardless almost what those are, sort of I carry with me, was sort of an essential shaping of my approach, I would say.
Yeah, Mark, I think you might be brewing a question, are you?
One, only that politicians are usually troublemakers, and sometimes I think, and in a good way, it's the desire to kind of run towards the trouble, I think, is what
I like that.
this whole kind of story needs, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? Like, some of the time it's trouble just for its own sake, but I think I always joke that I'm a history and politics student and they are troublemakers, and in a good way. I think you need to want to see the problem. I think maybe it's difficult work, right?
I think building on that, there's something about being comfortable in navigating the unknown, right? And being willing to challenge perceived authority or truths or whatever that may be. And I think the space we're in, and particularly the time we're in, we have so many unknowns. There are so many questions we don't have the answers to. So to have the courage and the willingness and sort of the sense of trust, even if that is hard, right, to step into the process and both be willing to challenge authority, challenge ideas. I guess I enjoy that. Not every day, but most of the time. So that's definitely part of the choice of direction.
One other thing that I've noticed about you, and I think this is to your point about, and my experience of talking to you, is that there's a whole lot of stuff, I think it's how your mind works, brought together and kind of harmonized in one big sort of whole. But one thing I noticed about you compared to some people, and it's not entirely unique, but is that ability to, you're really thinking about, when you think about the change to the world we need to create, you do talk about social justice and how that is a just transition. And we'll get more into kind of the challenges of circularity and stuff in just a minute, but it does strike me that, I guess it's part of your background, but it feels quite strong, quite a guiding principle for you. And that's not true of everybody we meet, right? So some are more like industrial revolution types, and some see more kind of a social aspect to it. Do you think that sets you apart from others, or where does that feature in sort of relative hierarchy of the things you've got to think about and do in your job or in your life, really?
Or just more like the holistic mindset?
I think the latter.
I definitely think there's grounding in sort of social democratic principles of growing up in the Nordics, in Scandinavia. I think that's definitely part of, the kind of makeup. And I guess it's not a complete coincidence that I've also worked for a Swedish company, right? With a sort of a vision that really is anchored in how to create a better everyday life for the many people, which has also come from a heritage of very social democratic principles. So I think for me, there is definitely growing up with that sense of equality, access to welfare for all, really growing up with that. And I guess naively, and reflecting on that as well, having lived abroad for many years now, all my adult life, in fact, in the UK and other countries, to take that quite for granted as I was growing up. And having the luxury and the privilege of taking that for granted. Even if obviously, yes, there are issues, but nevertheless, in the grand scheme of things, that was sort of a given, right? To have the choice to go into the world. So I think it comes and stems from that to a great extent. But there is also a sort of a strong value set in me, particularly around the fact that, like, it has to be about well-being for all. And ultimately, research shows that as well. We don't actually enjoy our lives if everyone else is unequal. The rich are also not happy if there's an extreme inequality going on around your life. Science also tells us we are better off when we collaborate. We have a better life when we support each other, when we're connected. So I think there's a strong value base. I think it's also a sense of maybe how my mind works. I don't think that's particularly unique. I think everyone has their own strengths, right? I'm a holistic thinker. I like the big picture. I try to make sense of things and how they connect. Annoyingly, my brain wants to find the connections whether I want to or not. So it's one of those things that I don't enjoy staying in silos, because I inherently know that things don't work like that in nature or in the world. But again, I would not suggest that that's completely unique to me at all. I think it's just that everybody has their own sort of strength of character, the way their character sort of, or their particular makeup sort of has an ability to add value, But yeah, does that answer your question, Leo?
Classic. It opens up another thing for me there, and Mark, jump in if you want, but which is, I guess that predisposition in the way your head operates, I don't know whether that sort of makes you the sort of person that would end up with a circularity job, which is necessarily about how a system comes together, or whether in a way doing that job drove you in that direction. I mean, maybe it doesn't really matter, but I guess I'm going to make a jump then from there to, and I think if we can get to the heart of the conversation, it's not that the rest of it isn't the heart, but I saw that you were involved in a thing called the Circularity Gap report, I think, earlier this year. That's right. I remember you talking about it at the time. And if I'm right in saying that piece of very esteemed research, Global has reported that it looks like the amount of circularity in economies worldwide is possibly going backwards a little bit. And I see that we see an awful lot of discussion about circularity in places, and everyone, I think, says that sounds like a good principle, but finding good examples of making it happen seems more difficult. So I'd love to explore with you for a bit now things like, what would it take to make this idea much more mainstream and much more well known than it is? I think we know about it on this call and those probably tuning in on the live stream, but if I went to my mum and dad and said, what do you know about resource constraints, we might use them. So talk to me a little bit about, from your point of view, your vantage point, like about what might we do to kind of get this thing to be much more mainstream than perhaps it currently is?
There's a lot in your question and what you just said, right? But I think making the assumption that everybody gets what the circular economy is, I think maybe where to start. It's a complex terminology. It's called an economy for a start. So what is it? How does it work? If you just sort of literally boil it down to one reflection, there was like an old Buddhist sort of way to meditate on the nature of the world by meditating on a grain of sand. And more recently, the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh suggested actually sit and meditate on the nature of a sheet of paper. And actually, if you do, you naturally would sit with the interdependency of the total global value chain of producing one simple product, including the dependency on nature, growing forests, global value chains, small things being built around the world, small components being shipped around the world to create something bigger. And I guess if you then take an everyday object like a smartphone, sit and meditate on that for a bit and imagine the complexity and the interdependency of the world economy and labor across the world and what we take for granted every day. And I think, we had this conversation, Leo, about like how can we scale circularity and how can we make it more mainstream? I think if most people just spent 5 minutes meditating on the complexity of a smartphone, which most people, certainly in Western countries, have in their day-to-day lives, and understanding that all of that takes mining of resources in one part of the world, extractive practices in other parts of the world, labor in China, lithium in Peru, and then you start to look at what that looks like with the premise that we then chuck them away, right? So the idea of both the finite resource extraction part of that and the enormous resource intensive mobility of parts and products around the world and the waste stream. So there's something around coming back to reflecting on this highly commoditized, extremely commercialized world that we've created, and that every little piece that we're used to, buying, consuming, using every day, including single-use items. So I think that's something that, in a way, most of us, I have maybe too much time to think about, but most people don't take a lot of time to consider. You know, we live in a fast-paced world. Things turn up on our doorsteps. We have an Amazon account, it turns up within hours. So that dimension is almost like drowning out the fact that these are extremely highly complex and resource-intensive value chains. So that's one dimension, but I guess it's positive that there's so much noise, talk about circularity, so much energy and interest. I think someone said in the LinkedIn chat that it's great that there's so much talk about it, but we need to see action, and we need to see businesses scaling this up and doing it in the real world. And of course, absolutely, we do also need the understanding of it. We do need to socialize the awareness of what it is and how to work with it. And then without this becoming a monologue, I guess I want to jump to the idea that we're trying to shift from a linear model of production and consumption and manufacturing to circular ones. There's a different reality for legacy companies that have existed for 80 years, like Ikea, that has, you know, built in the infrastructure of a linear manufacturing system. And then you can imagine startups that are agile, smart, they're starting from the beginning, they are digital first, digital natives, and you can actually embed a circular business model from the beginning of your business model. And then you have everything in between. It takes a very different approach depending on the sector and the company to address what circularity means for them. But of course, the premise is this, and you alluded to it. Companies that produce goods are reliant on extracting resources from the earth, whether they are finite, minerals, or renewable, wood. And ultimately, if we produce and extract at a quicker rate than can be replenished or goes to waste, then that business is going out of business soon, right? We're running out of resources. And I think the facts are now clear. We have reports like UNEP's Global Outlook report that came out a few months ago. So I think it's about making ourselves more aware, understanding it, doing a bit of research on resource use, and starting to look at what does it mean for where I'm at, both in my life and in the company I work for.
That's brilliant. We've had a conversation with our design team, and they're thinking more smartly about designing for taking things back in at the beginning of the process in a way that we hadn't done before. And I'm imagining it. And what happens then? Because I can sort of see that the designer will say, yeah, you're right, this is definitely future-proofing, very smart, we're into it. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a company you've worked at, but maybe you've seen it. But what's the sort of one or two levers that then should be pulled? How do you where do you chunk it down, maybe?
Now, of course, the principles around circularity is, and there's so much content available out there, right, for free. If you want to look at like all the sort of toolkits, the frameworks, the principles, you Google it and it's out there. So you don't need expensive, honestly, you don't need expensive consultants. You don't need to necessarily, you don't need to do that to actually find out what it is, right? In some cases, I'm not saying not to use consultants. I'm just saying there's a lot that people can do off their own back with an enormous amount of free resources available. But of course, it's like fundamentally as a mindset and chunking it down to start to look at how do you narrow the use of resource use? So how you use resources smarter, use recycled materials, for example, rather than virgin, try to phase out fossil-based material and finite materials where possible, designing products for longevity and durability, how they actually last, and how you can then design in a whole business model around repair, remanufacturing, and prolonging the life of those products. So that basically the next use phase of using for longer is the other dimension of circularity for design, taking the design side into it. There are lots of ways to design products for circular use. And by the way, arguably, there is no such thing as a circular product. It's products that are designed with circular capabilities.
Right.
For example, in order to last, durable products that can also be repaired, disassembled, remanufactured. But that requires a consumer behavior change too, right? It desires participation around how to consume, making sure people look after products, making sure they look after things in the long term. And now, of course, you can hear that I'm taking a consumer-facing lens to it rather than a B2B or a manufacturing lens. But so there are lots of things we can do there. And I think also it's about then also understanding, and this is critical for those who are new to this, legislation is forcing us anyway. The EU Green Deal and the Eco Design Directive and all sorts of new legislation coming our way is now including CSRD disclosure and reporting mandates. is that this is no longer going to be optional. So a company should either look at that and go, right, this is a business opportunity to be ahead of the game and find a leadership position to see where do we want to thrive and flourish before, and not be the laggards that just only kind of meets compliance when we have to, and take this as an opportunity to own a commercial space or to start to really position themselves right. So I think that up until relatively very recently, it wasn't clear. For example, circular business model, yes, they are essential, particularly say recycled content in products is essential to meet carbon and science-based targets for emissions reductions. Often, like for us in Ikea, 50% of our emissions sits in the material and food ingredients that goes into our products and food offer. And then, of course, we've mapped that across the value chain, including waste and end of product life as well. So it will meet and support businesses to meet their climate targets, particularly if they've set aggressive targets and scope 1, 2, and 3 targets. It's coming anyway. And I think that's really important to make everyone aware of and the opportunities that come with that.
Isn't there quite a unsophisticated sort of basic economic argument to be made pretty soon that you will just be richer by doing this? I mean, already I have a sense that a lot of people, the sustainability movement doesn't make that point because they feel like it's a slightly dirty way to frame it. But is that not the case? I mean, it's just better business, isn't it? Most of the time.
Yes, and not always. Depending on the business and depending on the reality and depending on the market. I think this is, you could argue if you go far ahead in the future, yes, absolutely, because imagine, and this is where this kind of long-term thinking and more like scenario thinking is much more useful to model these potential futures compared to forecasting ways of thinking, right? Because businesses are used to forecast based on a past and expecting that future to be the same as the past. Of course, we know that's not the case. So price volatility, resource constraints, geopolitics, all kinds of risks are featuring into not having access to raw materials in the same way as we had in the past. We know that. So in those scenarios, you can argue that if you haven't invested in alternative circular value chains for recycled content or diversified your business model to also take into account secondary raw materials or say secondhand, then you're very vulnerable, right, for a linear business model that we know will be disrupted. So I would say in some cases, as you say, Mark, there is, particularly if you're new business or there is an area of your business that is just like low-hanging fruit, obvious to go after. Right. Secondhand market from a furniture perspective is actually just a given. Like it's happening anyway. People are shopping, loads of secondhand. If you're in country as well, cities like London, or in all of the Nordics, it's just smart shopping behavior. And maybe to your point, that's maybe where traditional sustainability professionals or environmentalists sort of go a bit like, oh, we can't talk about the commerciality of it, but we have to, otherwise there is no business behind it. So circularity is an economy, right? It's both impact in terms of nature and climate, as well as commercial. However, the challenge is, the economics don't always add up still, right? This is where legislation comes in. It's still cheaper to procure virgin materials for the most part compared to secondary raw materials, secondhand materials. So again, I would say one of the reasons why I particularly enjoy working for a company the size of Ikea is that we can use our scale to lobby for positive policy change in order to incentivize and really lend weight to the message that we need to change the policy levers to enable businesses to scale up circular business models as well. So it's both. And I think maybe that's also a bit unpopular because everybody wants circularity to be the solution. And we would love it to be the silver lining, the arrow that will sort of cut through it all and be the solutions to everything. I don't think it is for everything. It's a much more differentiated model. It's a much more granular and sort of complex solution. But it's about finding the right parts of the circularity kind of ecosystem, if you like, or the right business model for the right problems. And also, to be fair, in the right markets. If you have markets where, say, consumers aren't ready to buy secondhand, or there isn't a secondhand market available, then that makes no sense. And it's obvious when I say it like that. But then in other markets, it's actually what people are already doing. So there's a real sort of, you need to take a kind of a regional and a context-specific approach to circularity solutions.
Interesting. I was having a conversation with the chief sustainability officer of one of those online mattress companies today. I won't mention who it was, but she was talking about how they tested various ways of talking about it, and absolutely nobody wants a secondhand mattress, basically. It just sounds horrible. But a refurbished mattress sells quite well, actually.
Mm-hmm.
I think I thought about a company actually in the Netherlands that was in a similar space, I think, from our previous conversation. So there is definitely like a economics of it, and there's the way that it's presented. And you're right, people are looking for silver bullets because the problem is terrifying, and we sort of all hope it's going to be really easy, and all the carbon will be sucked back into the ground, and we all live happily ever after. But I guess the reality is more nuanced than that.
It's much more nuanced, and I think there's some very tricky big dilemmas and paradoxes, right? We will be faced increasingly with dilemmas. And I think when you look at the circularity movement, and this is something going back to the Circularity Gap report that you referred to, it's the 6th year that the Circular Economy Foundation has published the Circular Gap report. And this year, 2024, was the first year where they also partnered with Deloitte. And the reason for that was partly that they could do a more localized distributed model as well, where you have a global circularity gap report, but also per countries. So I was also part of launching that. But I think one of the insights from this year's report, and you've alluded to it, the global economy and the use of resources, extraction and consumption of resources globally is going up. And in that context, circularity, the percentage of circularity is going down. So it is a hard reality that we're not moving fast enough on the circulating materials back into the economy. But I think what's also interesting that comes out of that report is to get a more differentiated approach to realize that, of course, they have segmented markets into sort of 3 buckets. There are shift markets, build markets, and grow markets. And that's based on where they are in terms of their economic development. And that links directly back to your previous point around just transitions and climate justice and social justice. Because the hard reality for us in Western countries is that we consume more resources than our fair share. That's a fact. And yet, even within wealthy countries, we have a polarization of wealth, right? So we have growth in extremely wealthy individuals, and then we also have an increasingly large part of the population that's facing poverty and struggling to have their everyday needs met. And then, of course, we have parts of the world where they really need infrastructure to build schools and roads, and they should, in fact, be allowed to use the resources required to build the infrastructure required for the common development of that nation. So I think it's also useful and then complex for us to take on board that it's not sort of one global resource use problem. Yes, there's an aggregate resource use problem of all our global economies and also the emissions factors to that. But there's going to have to be a much more differentiated approach to what that means for shift countries that need, like ourselves, that need to actually shift out of overconsumption into different sort of models of production consumption, try to dematerialize our business models, try and meet our needs by using less resources. Like, what a great design challenge. What a great creative challenge. And then allow for grow markets to actually have a chance to stabilize, but also have resources for what they need. And then the build markets that really need to lift up their standard of living and to meet the well-being of their citizens. And I think that level of differentiation creates a huge amount of complexity, but also a different level of responsibility depending on what country you're in and how you then develop your business models, both to meet the profitability imperative and the kind of responsibility around resource consumption. Not a simple task, but understanding that is a good starting point.
Mark, have you got a question or shall I go?
No, please go.
Hege, one thing that you've talked about, which I've pondered a lot and not found enough solutions to, but I just want to see if you've got any clues, frankly, is you talked about dematerialization, which I really like. That's the idea, as I understand it, you're just less stuff is going through the process of manufacturing to give someone a benefit that they might exchange value for. And I really like the idea of dematerialized value proposition. We talk about demand switching and how do we switch demand from bad behaviors and unhealthy ones to healthier ones. And one of the ones that's the hardest is switch you out of buying something to buying nothing at all and getting your kicks in other better ways. Might be a social event with a friend, or you go to a park run with or sponsored by a brand. Are there any examples that you see anywhere that you think of as, and it might be known, that's fine, but are there any examples of dematerialization that you see that you like that we could use as references in our minds, as examples to kind of copy in future? Anything come to mind?
You're testing me now. There's definitely, I don't know if these are the best ones, but I really like, and this is a localized one, so I think it's hard sometimes to bring the kind of at scale examples, but just because it pops into my head as we're talking, and it's a local one that I use, which I love, which is a social enterprise called Library of Things. We live in flats in London, right? So you don't actually have space to store stuff anyway. But that, like, the fact that you can access the tools that you might not need very often for a small fee. It's a rental model, right? It's a service model. So you can either pay a subscription and access tools that you need once in a while, or pay per use. So, you know, that's an example of where you pay for a service, but you access the tools that you need when you need it, and it's on demand as opposed to, and there are many models like that, right? Obviously with, say, Zipcar or any kind of other sort of service-based business models. I think what's interesting now is there's definitely a sort of a movement towards wanting to find regenerative business models, more sort of, you know, net positive business models, which to some extent has to include less, you know, less material use. And it, again, shifting from ownership to access, which is sort of what I just described. That doesn't always come problem-free, right? Because it's still a question of who owns what. So I think the kind of ownership dimension comes in as a question in some of these service-based, so-called dematerialized business models. But of course, the movement from mindset that we need to own it all, and we know the stats around, if you own a car, often it sits 75% in your drive or parked 75% of the time. So the idea of like public access to things or is something I think we have to go in the direction of. And I think it was George Monbiot that coined the term, what was it, public luxury and private sufficiency. And I really like that, because ultimately it's about having everyone meet their needs. Like, we have resources for everyone to access what they need, but not for everyone to have an individual private swimming pool and a tennis court and 3 homes and what have you, right? So there's lots of different dimensions. And there's someone sharing various examples here as well.
Yeah, Mo from Ellen MacArthur Foundation, who should be able to have some good examples.
Absolutely.
So that's really fascinating, actually. And I think that public luxury and private sufficiency flip is really quite an amount. I heard Kate Rayworth talking about it as well. And Mark, have you got something you want to ask?
No, just that only to observe that good design is often less, isn't it? And that may be. We looked at electric cars, and there's an adage that in an ICE car you have 60,000 parts, and then in an EV 6,000. So almost, whether, regardless of the carbon economics of it, just less. Often the better solution is the simpler solution, right? It's kind of, there must be less bits in a wind turbine than there are in a nuclear reactor. So let's build more wind turbines than nuclear, you know, yeah.
I think it starts with design, right? It has to start with the intentional design of how our entire everyday life, how our systems, how our products, how our solutions are designed. Because if they are ultimately designed to last, designed for going back into the loop, designed to be repaired, then of course that's part of how you will engage. First of all, how you'll create your business model for a start, design the success of your business from the start, but also how you then have to design the whole operations of your business, the reverse logistic dimension, how you engage with your customer, how you set up your communication with the customer. And I guess this is part of the challenge, right? So that obviously, if you're an oil tanker, it's a slow turn. If you're an agile, you know, small young company, you can sort of do it from the beginning. But nevertheless, I'm pleased to see that both the pull from some markets and customers and the pull from, you know, insights around resource constraints and actually, and even the cost picture of that and legislation means that it's a must. It has to happen. And of course, we still work in business with the business case for change, right? And I think that's just the frustrating reality of where we are. I think people like myself that sit in the corporate sustainability space, one of the challenges I find, at least personally in my role, is to hold that tension between what science is telling us, the speed that we need to move at, that science is telling us, and that we must, and really trusting the science, and then the speed of change in big, heavy organizations.
Yeah.
And of course, there's a massive gap, right? So to sit with that tension and to nevertheless, find the ways and the levers and the acupressure points for change, and be like, the river that flows around the obstacles. This is where, for me, some of the regenerative leadership training and development that I've been doing is really critical, to not go slightly mad at times, to find principles that empowers me to be a bit sort of jiu-jitsu about the whole thing, because you need to sort of navigate the system and the ecosystem in terms of where the energy flows are, and to stop in some place, you need to find another lever for change. But that tension is sometimes quite a heavy burden, I have to say, because it never feels enough, and it's always more to be done, and yet you can't sort of despair, right? So
I wonder if this is a place to ask the question, because something you said to me before that I wrote down, and I don't know how it fits with moving fast, really, but you talked once about cathedral thinking. Like that's the kind of mindset of people that are able to start a project in the knowledge that they might not see it to completion in their lifetime, but they're working on a greater, amazing thing, and it'll be there for generations to come. So I guess cathedrals, that's the logic, right? Why does that feature in why is that one of the thoughts that kind of bubbled around in your head when it comes to these sorts of this sort of challenge?
It was actually Greta Thunberg that said it in her speech, right? That sort of reminded me of that mental concept. And I think what's really helpful about it is that the gravitational pull of short-term thinking is very high and strong in companies and our economy in general. Our election cycles are 4 years, our profit cycles are maybe 3, but definitely 1. So there's a kind of gravitational pull to deliver now, think now, and really kind of the KPIs are short term, the returns are relatively short term. Even in the company that I work for, where we have some degree of luxury by not having shareholders. So, we have value creation goals, we have value-based decision making. And yeah, of course, you have a traditional business model that is about making sure that we're on track. And I think the system is so strong. So for me, having these sort of mental models to remind me that actually take a step back, and I get energy from that as well. Like, you have to raise your gaze to above the parapet, just to regularly take a breath and step back and remind us that this is for the long term. This is not just within this kind of rat race or the hamster wheel that we're in. And I think it also, for me, kind of reconnects me in part with a sort of a degree of moral leadership and responsibility that in some respects we don't talk enough about, I think, in our culture, and we're almost uncomfortable talking about it inside corporate companies as well. So I can't speak for everyone, of course, but I think there's something around this being increasingly comfortable with talking about the responsibility of the decisions that we make for future generations, and not make it just be rhetoric that doesn't really mean much. So yeah, for me, the cathedral thinking concept sort of reminds me of stepping back, and gives me permission as well, that it's a critical part of the process to step back and look at the long-term horizon, and to trust. I think there's a degree of, not to make this mystical, but it is about nevertheless apply myself, with the kind of a long-term trust that the actions I take now, I may not see the full extent of the impact of that, but my intentions are clear. And I must trust to some extent that it will make a difference in one way or another. Some of it's really obvious, some of it's literally a business case going through and securing funding and seeing something scaled, seeing something rolled out. But I think there is also a more sort of subtle part of that, which is to kind of mobilize people in the organization without quite knowing what you're unleashing, allowing the energy to flow in such a way that your intent is sort of coming through in your behavior. So it can be quite tangible, the time you're building something, but you don't know what the outcome will be, and you might not see it in your lifetime, even if it's the lifetime in the company that you work for, right? Ultimately, sometimes I also speak to colleagues, and particularly sort of CEO level, where it's like, well, my tenure is this time. I need to turn the company around in this time. So they're also forced to limit their mindset around what time dimension they need to deliver results within. So it's helpful for me. And I think it's maybe sort of a mindset that we need to bring back in much more in our general sort of thinking.
I wonder whether anyone ever pulls off anything really astonishingly interesting without having a really freaking big thought that of a cathedral scale. Mark, I'm probably going to puff you up here unnecessarily, but when you talk about trillions of dollars of retrofitting every public swimming pool in Europe with a data center where the excess heat warms the water, like this is one example, small fraction of the sort of that sort of cathedral thinking, although I guess you'd get it done in one lifetime. But
there's something about setting a very large goal that has a utility beyond whether you have to mean it, but there's a utility for a huge goal to galvanize, as you say, to shift people's priorities in at least in the right direction. I think however hairy the goal is, in our case, it's mostly just pure ego, but yeah.
whatever works.
But also interestingly, people get excited about big missions. They do, like him or loathe him, Musk, whatever they do. I mean, I was sitting with the CEO of a large corporation. This I was saying before we started to talk, and he wouldn't have been talking to us if we just talked small. He was talking to us because he could emotionally get behind an audacious goal, but then he could kind of see himself within. So maybe you're allowed to have some ego in it. Probably quite a good thing.
I think our egos sort of propel us forward, right? And sort of it's the agency to act and to make things happen, and both the belief in ourselves and our ideas. So I don't think we should dismiss the ego for sure.
No.
I think in the example you just gave, maybe the ego's kind of left the planet, but that's a different sort of point. But there's something around, I think for me, what comes up here is the bridge to sort of some degree of courageous leadership and storytelling, because of course, as you say, there needs to be this compelling future and this vision of where we want to go to. If you're going to ask anyone to make changes to what they know today, particularly if it's still profitable, right? There's a line that I picked up from a colleague not that long ago, and I can't remember who, I don't know actually who to attribute it to, but there was something along the lines of nothing is more dangerous than a business model or idea that's outdated that's still profitable. Yeah. And of course, that's the problem. You're asking a CFO, a CEO to change direction based on uncertainties, maybe before it's so really obvious that it's in decline potentially or won't work anymore. But of course, telling a compelling, positive future rather than like, you must change, otherwise your company will die. Like, that's not the pull, right? That people are going to kind of mobilize behind. It might mobilize some concern and some fear, but there needs to be a direction of travel.
Describing building a cathedral, exactly. we know what it could, how good it could be.
But I think in that though, there is also a need for kind of quite courageous leadership, because that story is not always popular. It's not even always wanted. I've seen stories where you need to be quite courageous to question a narrative that a leader might have around the success of a certain business model or a certain reality. And actually, it needs to be quite carefully navigated as well. And now I'm being a bit abstract, but I think it takes quite a skill around like navigating stories and the change of stories. Like you said, egos are attached to success stories as well, right? So if you're suddenly coming to say, well, what we might have believed was a good thing and have always sort of stood behind, you need to sort of, find a way to really move people with you on that journey as well. And I think that takes quite a lot of courageous leadership.
Is that where the concept of hospicing comes in? Because it's that's not a sort, by the way, hospice, you mentioned hospicing modernity, and I've heard it used by other people who work in more just I'm a relative newcomer to that environment. In the world I came from, it's not a thing you ever heard being talked about. So tell me a little bit about what that means and what it might mean in a business or organizational context.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. I think,
Good. I like
what we're observing, and there's a whole kind of movement, certainly not within mainstream corporates, I would say, but there's a whole kind of sense of understanding and acceptance that one system is dying and on its way to shift and make space for another one, and that a new one is emerging. And within that, I think some of the useful terminologies and phrasing is that there is a way to hospice to help the things that needs to die. How do we do that well? How do we facilitate good endings to things? We're not very good at endings, right, in our Western world in general. But how do we consciously become good at, and what skills are required to have good endings? And then how do we midwife new things and bring them to life? And I think for me, they're useful distinctions to reflect on also in terms of like, who am I? Am I a midwife? Am I a hospice worker? Or when am I a hospice worker and when am I a midwife? And what does that mean for my role? And what does that mean for sort of the emotional capacity and the practical capacity of requiring things to end well and how to bring things to life? And I think for me, it just opens up this whole new universe of sort of mental capacity, needing to expand emotionally in my leadership capabilities, empathy, a lot about empathy. Like if things are ending and someone's not quite sure or knowing it's ending, like how do you help something to end with empathy and love even, right? In a corporate context, that's one to consider. And, how do we bring things to life knowing that if it's too premature, it won't live on, it's like, it needs to be held for long enough for it to have strength of its own to stand on its own. And that is actually something I even speak about today and with some of my colleagues around, like, if a really important idea is too nascent, if you pass it on too soon, it's like a green shoot, if it hasn't got roots of its own, if it hasn't got robustness of its own, it will die or it will be stamped on or if it'll be shut down. So it's useful to understand some of the transitions that we need to manage, the skills that we need to manage those transitions, and the role that we play in one system on its way out and one system on its way in.
That's amazing. I've never really thought about it like that before. I'd like to have a workshop where that was a big part of it.
It puts a different lens on it, right, to what we're actually dealing with here. It's deeply emotional, deeply systemic, and complex emotional work.
There wasn't a lot of hospicing blockbuster, was there? I wonder. I feel like that might be, maybe someone was, probably some outplacement consultants and some life coaches, but I think that's quite fascinating as a method.
Honoring, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. So
and I think this is really overlooked, the human dimension of that, to hold people with love and empathy in change processes, whoever they are, it's going to be absolutely critical, because we will see heightened emotions on scales that we've never experienced before as people get more stressed, resource scarcity really kicks in. How can we develop our capacity to hold space for love and kindness and empathy as these changes intensify? That's not just something you do in your meditation or yoga class, right? That's something you have to take to work.
Yeah, I mean, that's really fascinating. There's a whole thing on that. That's going to be enormous. Wow. I might get straight into some questions, because I think Matt Davies very kindly has done it. Matt, I could probably get you on, Matt, to ask it. I think
it did get a bit long-winded. Sorry, Leah.
No, it's fine. You've got to do it 130 characters or less.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, hi, thanks for this. This is great. So the question I had was, obviously, the companies have their part to play in the circular economy, whether that's the scope 3 emissions or whether it's sourcing materials. A lot of the responsibility is still going to fall on the consumer to play their part in recycling, really simple example, or sourcing remanufactured products. I'm aware of this, but it's not obvious to me how to do it, even though I know it exists and it's really important. How do we enable the consumer to do that, or reward the consumer? And are you seeing any trends where it's really well adopted in a particular region? And if so, is that repeatable, or is like every region going to be different levers to pull?
Yeah, no, I think in short, a bit, you're alluding to it, and I touched on it earlier as well. There is no like one answer to that question, depending on the business model, the product, the region, what have you. But, you know, we see, as an example, this is a strategic decision that we've made at Ikea, which is to make our vegan plant-based food products cheaper than anything else. So, you know, you can actually steer it from a pricing perspective.
Yep.
And that's something you can apply as a principle to any solution, right? Any service, any product. You can price steer. And we know that particularly in the cost of living crisis reality for most people, price steering is a very powerful tool.
Yeah.
And ultimately, for us also, the kind of second-hand dimension for us is also what we call meaningful affordability, because affordability is so critical for people to have access to what they need. And if you can pass on the fact that circular business models to some extent are in fact cheaper for the consumer, whether it's a pay-as-you-go or a second-hand model or whatever it is, it's already smarter, right? It's smarter shopping, full stop. But then I think there's ways that companies can also reward through reward systems, through add-ons, through added benefits. We're also looking at specifically how we can use our, which we've done to some extent with campaigns, but, you know, how to use our marketing platform to really enable behavior change, normative change, and to raise awareness around choices. A lot of our research shows that people are still, kind of surprisingly, but maybe not, like quite confused about what to do. Like, what is the right thing to do in this long list of millions of things that I feel should be done, but what can I do? So I think companies can sort of, depending on the company, the product, the brand, you know, if it's consumer facing or not, there's lots of tools. But again, it needs to come back to conscious strategic intent, right? Sort of we have set out not just that we want to become a circular business, but also that we want to make sustainable and healthy living mainstream. So back to this, like setting strategic goals in the organization that then you can mobilize action from the organization around and unleash whatever tools are available. There are so many levers for change, and ultimately it needs to be affordable, it needs to be accessible, it needs to be desirable. It's like, if it's the shittiest option, no one's going to do it, right? We know that. If it's perceived as too expensive, they won't do it either. So it needs to be as good as new and better that we have.
That's good.
Yeah, that's a good answer.
Any other questions from the group? If not, I've got one or two to close, and then we'll finish in a couple of minutes. I don't think anyone else has got one, have they? One of the things I want to know, and we sort of try and do this with everyone we talk to. Imagine you're reading a chapter in this book and it's been all about what we've talked about today. One of the questions I think for people is what sort of skill or aptitude we're going to most need to develop if we want to be part of accelerating this great transition that's going on in society and economy now. Is there one thing that we, all of us should really double down on to kind of get ourselves ready to make it go faster and more smoothly?
One, this is back to this kind of silver bullet thinking in a way, but I think for me, it's definitely more than one, but there is definitely something around the acceptance and the reflection around interdependency. Like, you know, this mindset that I can be an individual, I'm not reliant, I can pay myself out of this, I can move to wherever and be away from the impacts. That's an absolute fantasy. So it's something to sort of really meditate on and understand. It's maybe not a skill, but I think it's a kind of an understanding and acceptance of the interdependent nature of life and how we are absolutely intrinsic into the web of life and the interdependency of life. And for me, it's starting to really reconnect with that and to cultivate the gratitude of that, because I think with a kind of a fantasy of independence, if we act from that place, we will continue to make the same mistakes that we've done in the past. And I think if we accept and embrace and celebrate the interdependency and the fact that we are in this beautiful web of life, we will start to maybe take different decisions. And I think that will also bring with it the sense of systems thinking, understanding complexity, our role within that, and to navigate that, because I think we live in an extraordinary, complex world full of paradoxes and dilemmas, but it's also extraordinarily beautiful. So to really come back to that and step out of the despair, right, of how horrible everything is and how impossible everything is.
So, Hege, can you organise for us all to come to a retreat somewhere in beautiful Norway, and I think you'd be perfect for it.
Great. We'll see what we can do. Absolutely. I think there's lots of people doing that really well already.
Right.
Meant someone. Yeah.
Really amazing. Mark, any final?
No, only that I think we all know that we actually like life better when I'm fascinated by this paradox with us as individuals, where collaboration and community, and I constantly reminded myself, I'll have a really intense 2 work weeks, and then you'll hang out with some mates or go to see a band, and you think, gosh, this is quite nice, isn't it? I quite like doing this. And it's amazing how we forget that as human beings. I'm fascinated by that. Because it's very deeply and very obvious that we love, that is a much better way of living. I think any human being on the planet can relate to it, but somehow we seem to forget it. We're like fish. We forget it almost immediately.
The world takes us up, yeah. So look, I'm going to end our conversation. Maybe Hege, you can stay for 1 second at the end, and I'll say thank you to you properly. But
absolutely.
I guess the things that there's so much in there that stood out to me, and I will post an edited version of this to YouTube shortly afterwards. I think that coming from today's conversation, and each time I speak to you, my sort of soul and my brain grows. I think I really like the idea of meditating on my iPhone.
Yeah, not by being on it, meditating
Snapchat.
on it, not scrolling.
Yeah, definitely. I love the fact that sort of literacy that you use around how material flows happen in business and economies and societies, but having a much more nuanced understanding of different countries and different life stages of different organizations and countries in relation to that, I think is a really smart and great way of thinking about it. I like the ways that you talked about getting involved in thinking creatively about the whole nature of design, but really designing how we think about things in the first place, not just the models themselves. And then those last 2 or 3 comments or themes we've touched on are the scale of really big thinking around how to let the old world die with kindness, I think, which is a really rare and unspoken of thing. And then just now about interdependency, which in many ways sort of links it back all together, and in so many ways for me characterizes how how your mind and your soul works really in respect of that. So I really appreciate the words you've shared with us today. Mark, great to have you here.